The evening was everything a birthday celebration should be. The house hummed with conversation, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses. Friends and family filled the living room and kitchen, spilling onto the patio where the grill still gave off faint trails of smoke. It was my 56th birthday, a milestone, a moment to reflect on everything I had built: a successful career, a stable family, and a comfortable life. I stood near the fireplace, holding a whiskey on the rocks, watching the people who made up my world. Willow, my wife of 17 years, floated through the crowd like a hostess in her element. Her red dress hugged her figure, and her laughter rang out as she entertained the guests. For a moment, I let myself feel proud. Despite the ups and downs, we had weathered life's storms together. But something gnawed at the edges of my contentment, a vague unease I couldn't shake. "Happy birthday, big bro," came a familiar voice behind me. I turned to see Charles, my younger brother. He grinned as he clapped a hand on my shoulder, his easy charisma as sharp as ever. "Charles," I said, smiling, "glad you made it. Thought your busy schedule might keep you away." He laughed. "You kidding? I wouldn't miss this. 40's a big one, old man. How's it feel?" I chuckled. Ancient, but still standing. Charles raised his beer bottle in a mock toast. "Well, here's to keeping the creaks out of your knees for another year." As he spoke, his eyes darted across the room. I followed his gaze instinctively and saw Willow standing by the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of wine. Her back was to us, but Charles's expression lingered a second too long. It wasn't a casual glance. "You okay?" I asked, my tone light but probing. Yeah, he said quickly, taking a swig of his beer. "Just seeing who's around." Something about his laugh felt forced, but I let it slide. The party carried on, and I made my rounds, thanking everyone for coming. Willow was the perfect partner, ensuring drinks were refilled and making everyone feel welcome. She was always good at that, playing the role of the attentive wife. But as the night wore on, I started noticing little things. Charles hovered near Willow more than usual. When she laughed at one of his jokes, she placed her hand on his arm, a touch that lingered. Their interactions weren't overt, but there was a closeness between them that felt wrong. Later, I found myself in the corner of the room talking to my friend Eric. "Big night, huh?" Eric said, sipping his beer. "Yeah, it's good to see everyone," I replied, though my attention kept drifting toward Willow and Charles. Eric followed my gaze and raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind?" I shook my head. "Nah, just tired, I think." He didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. Across the room, I saw Willow whisper something to Charles. His face lit up in a grin, and he leaned in close to hear her better. The pit of my stomach grew. "Having fun?" I asked Willow later, catching her alone in the kitchen as she refilled her wine glass. She looked up, startled. "Of course. It's your birthday. Why wouldn't I be?" "You seem busy tonight," I said, leaning against the counter. She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. "Just seems like you and Charles have a lot to talk about." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something defensive flashing in her eyes. "He's your brother, Jameson. We're just chatting. Don't start imagining things." "I'm not imagining anything," I said evenly. She sighed and looked away, muttering under her breath. I couldn't quite make out what she said, but it didn't matter. The unease was growing, and I couldn't ignore it. Charles joined me outside on the patio later. The night air was cool, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the crowded house. "Everything okay, Jameson?" he asked, leaning against the railing. "Yeah," I said shortly, watching the glow of the fire pit. "You sure? You've been quiet tonight." I looked at him, studying his face. He had that same easy grin he always wore, but something about it felt hollow. "How long are you staying in town?" I asked, changing the subject. "A few more days," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "Figured I'd stick around, maybe catch up with Willow and Lila." I raised an eyebrow. "Willow?" He shrugged. "She mentioned wanting to show me a new restaurant downtown. Figured I'd take her up on it." There was again that gnawing feeling in my gut. "You've been spending a lot of time with Willow lately," I said carefully. Charles's grin faltered. "She's family, Jameson. What's the problem?" No problem, I said. Just an observation. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself watching Willow and Charles more closely. She laughed too easily at his jokes. He stood too close when they spoke. It was subtle, but the signs were there, signs I should have noticed earlier. Lila, our daughter, came over to me at one point, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Great party, Dad," she said, giving me a quick hug. "Thanks, sweetheart," I said, trying to focus on her. "You having fun?" "Yeah, but you look distracted. Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on me for a moment before she walked away. By the time the last guest left, it was just the four of us, me, Willow, Charles, and Lila. The house was quiet, the remnants of the party scattered across the living room. "Thanks for coming, Charles," I said, my voice flat as I started picking up empty glasses. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, standing to leave. He glanced at Willow. "I'll call you tomorrow about that restaurant." Willow nodded, avoiding my gaze. I didn't say anything as Charles left. Willow began cleaning up, her movements quick and purposeful. "You don't have to do that tonight," I said, watching her. "It's fine," she said shortly. "Willow," I said, stepping closer. "Is there something you want to tell me?" She froze for a moment, then turned to face me. Her expression was unreadable. "No," she said finally. "Why would there be?" I studied her face, looking for cracks in the mask she wore so well. "Because something feels off," I said. She laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "You're imagining things, Jameson. Go to bed. It's late." I didn't press further, but the seed of doubt had been planted. And in the days to come, it would grow into something I could no longer ignore. As the clock neared midnight, I noticed Willow and Charles near the patio door. They stood close, their heads tilted toward each other, engaged in what seemed like an intimate conversation. Willow laughed, a sound that had once been so familiar to me, but now felt like a stranger's voice. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in years. My heart pounded as I made my way over to them. "Having fun?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though I could feel the tension in my chest. Willow turned to me, her smile faltering. "Of course," she replied, but there was an edge to her voice. It was too sweet, too forced. Charles looked at me and smirked, but said nothing. He took a casual sip of his beer, his eyes drifting away as if I were an inconvenience. "Funny," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "You two seem cozy tonight." Willow's eyes narrowed, and she sighed. "Oh, don't start, Jameson. It's your birthday. Can't you just enjoy the night without overthinking everything?" Charles chuckled, a sound that grated against my nerves. "Yeah, Jameson, relax. We're just having a good time." "You're right," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll let go. For now." I walked away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I kept an eye on them for the rest of the night, watching their every move. It was just after midnight when I saw it. Willow and Charles stood in the kitchen, their backs to the rest of the party. The sounds of laughter and music from the living room faded as I focused on them. Charles's hand brushed her lower back, lingering longer than what could be dismissed as accidental. Willow didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her lips grazing his ear as she whispered something that made him grin like a smug schoolboy. My heart pounded. The uneasy feeling that had been building all night now screamed at me. And before I could think twice, I stepped into the kitchen. Am I interrupting something? My voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of a loaded gun. Willow jumped, nearly spilling the wine in her glass. Her face flushed red, but it wasn't clear if it was guilt or anger. Charles, on the other hand, turned to face me, his grin evaporating. He looked like a kid caught raiding the cookie jar, but the defiance in his eyes told me he wasn't sorry. "Jameson," Willow started, setting her glass down on the counter. Her voice was steady, but the edge of panic was there. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," I said, my voice low but firm. "I want the truth. Right here, right now." She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an excuse. Charles shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent, his eyes darting between us. Finally, Willow crossed her arms and stood up straighter, her expression hardening. Fine, she said, her tone sharp. You want the truth? Charles has been more of a husband to me than you ever were. He's a real man, not just the paycheck you are. The words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. Charles flinched slightly, but didn't deny it. He didn't even try to look ashamed. Excuse me? I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with rage. You heard me, Willow said, her tone colder now, as if she had decided she was done pretending. You've been checked out for years, Jameson. Always working late, always distracted. Charles actually listens to me. He's here. Shut up, I snapped, my voice cutting through her rant like a knife. You don't get to justify this. I gave you everything. I worked late to provide for this family, for you. And this is how you repay me? Willow's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Charles, still silent, crossed his arms and leaned against the counter like he had no regrets. The sight of his smug indifference made my blood boil. Before I could speak again, a new voice cut through the tension. Dad. I turned to see my 16-year-old daughter, Lila, standing in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was a mix of anger and indifference. I hadn't even heard her come in. Lila, I started, but she interrupted me, her tone flat and unforgiving. Don't bother asking questions, she said, looking me dead in the eye. Charles has been spending more nights here than you. The room seemed to spin. My chest tightened as I struggled to catch my breath. What did you just say? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You heard me, Lila said, her eyes cold. It's not a secret, Dad. Mom and Charles have been sneaking around for months. You were just too busy or too blind to notice. Lila, stop, Willow said sharply, stepping toward her. But Lila shrugged her off. No, Lila said, glaring at her mother. He deserves to know. Everyone else knows. He's the only one who doesn't. I looked at Willow, my vision blurring with tears of anger and betrayal. Everyone else? I repeated, my voice shaking. Who's everyone else, Willow? How many people know about this? How long has this been going on? Willow looked away, her silence confirming everything. For over a year, Lila said bluntly. At least that's when I started noticing. Maybe longer. Who knows? Lila, that's enough. Willow snapped, her face turning red. No, it's not enough, I said, my voice rising. I turned back to Willow. A year? You've been sleeping with my brother for a year? In my house? While I was out working to support you and Lila? Willow opened her mouth, but no words came out. Charles finally spoke, his voice calm and condescending. Look, Jameson, I know this is a lot to take in, but maybe if you'd been more present, I snapped, closing the distance between us in 2 steps. My fist connected with his jaw before I even realized what I was doing. Charles stumbled back, crashing into the counter and knocking over Willow's wine glass. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the room. Jameson, stop! Willow screamed, grabbing my arm, but I shook her off. Don't you dare blame this on me, I growled, pointing at Charles, who was clutching his jaw. You're my brother, my blood, and you. I turned to Willow, my voice breaking. You're my wife. How could you do this to me? To our family? Willow started to cry, her hands covering her face. I didn't mean for it to happen, she sobbed. I didn't plan this. It just happened. Don't give me that bullshit, I said, my voice full of venom. You didn't trip and fall into his bed, Willow. You made a choice. Over and over again, Lila stood silently in the corner, watching the scene unfold with an expression I couldn't read. Part of me wanted to shield her from this mess, but it was too late for that. The damage was done. Charles straightened up, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth. You can't talk to her like that, he said, his voice low and menacing. I turned to him, my fist clenched. Get out of my house. Jameson, let's just get out. I roared, cutting him off. And don't ever come back. Charles hesitated, his eyes flicking to Willow, who gave him a small nod. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and walked out without another word. The sound of the front door slamming was deafening. The silence that followed was unbearable. Willow stood there, her face streaked with tears, while Lila leaned against the wall, arms crossed and head down. I looked at them both, my chest heaving. "You've destroyed this family," I said, my voice breaking. "Both of you." Willow sobbed harder, but I didn't stay to comfort her. I couldn't. I left the kitchen without a word, my feet moving on instinct. Each step felt heavier than the last as I made my way to the garage. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I flipped the light switch, and the fluorescent bulb buzzed to life, casting a stark glow over the cluttered space. My mind raced, replaying everything, the way Willow had whispered to Charles, Lila's cold indifference, and Willow's venomous words. "Charles has been more of a husband to me than you ever were." The betrayal sliced deeper each time I thought about it. Memories I'd once cherished, our family dinners, vacations, quiet nights on the couch, now felt like lies. Had it all been a facade? I leaned against the workbench, my breathing uneven. My eyes darted around the garage until they landed on the old metal lockbox in the corner, half hidden beneath a stack of dusty tarps. My hands trembled as I crossed the room, crouching down to pull it out. The box was heavy, the cold metal biting against my palm. I placed it on the workbench and stared at it for a moment, my chest tightening. Inside this box was the one thing I had kept locked away, something I thought I'd never need again. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything had changed. With a deep breath, I grabbed the key from its hiding spot behind the bench and unlocked the box. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents. A small pistol, polished and clean, resting on a piece of cloth. Next to it was an envelope containing documents I hadn't looked at in years. I ignored the papers and focused on the weapon. My fingers brushed against the cold steel, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of calm. But I wasn't going to use it. Not yet. I wasn't some impulsive fool who acted without thinking. This wasn't about violence. This was about control, about making them face the consequences of their actions. I slid the pistol into the waistband of my jeans and closed the box, locking it before shoving it back into the corner. Taking another steadying breath, I walked back into the house. The living room was dimly lit, the last of the candles flickering on the coffee table. The guests were gone. Willow, Charles, and Lila were sitting on the couch, their voices low and casual, as if nothing had happened. They didn't notice me at first, but when I stepped into the room, their laughter stopped abruptly. Willow's eyes widened when she saw me, her face pale. "Jameson," she said, her voice shaky. "What are you?" I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Sit down. All of you." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but one look at my face made him think twice. He exchanged a glance with Willow before settling back into his seat. Lila, who had been leaning against the armrest with her phone in hand, straightened up, her expression unreadable. "Now," I said, my voice low but firm, "we're going to have a conversation. No more lies. No more excuses." Willow shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Jameson, quiet," I snapped, my eyes locking onto hers. She froze, her mouth closing as tears welled in her eyes. I turned to Charles. "You want to explain to me how this started? How you thought it was okay to sleep with your brother's wife?" Charles swallowed hard, his usual cocky demeanor gone. "It's not what you think," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "It just happened? That's the best you can do." "Jameson," Willow interjected, her voice breaking, "please don't do this. We can talk about this later, just the two of us." "No," I said sharply, turning to her. "We're doing this now. In front of everyone. You wanted to play house with my brother? Fine, but you're going to own up to it." Lila, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Dad, what's the point of this? You already know the truth. What do you want from us?" I turned to her, my heart breaking at her tone. "What do I want? I want to understand how my own daughter could sit back and let this happen. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Or did you just not care?" Lila looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's not my fault, Dad. You were never here. You don't know what it was like." "What it was like?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean living in a house where I work my ass off to give you everything? While your mother, I stopped, my throat tightening. While your mother destroyed our family? Willow burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. Jameson, please. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't mean to hurt me? I said, my voice cold. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And you dragged our daughter into it. Charles stood up, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Jameson, look. I know you're angry. Sit down. I snapped, my hand instinctively moving to my waistband. Charles's eyes flicked downward, and he immediately sat back down, his face pale. The room fell into silence. I paced back and forth, my thoughts swirling like a storm. Finally, I stopped and turned to them. This is what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady. Charles, you're going to leave this house tonight and never come back. As for you, Willow, I paused, my chest heaving with emotion. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. I'm done. Willow looked up, her face streaked with tears. No, Jameson, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me. It's too late, I said, my voice breaking. You made your choice. Now you'll live with it. Lila stood up, her eyes filled with anger. So that's it? You're just going to walk away? I turned to her, my heart aching. I'm not walking away, Lila. I'm protecting myself. You'll understand one day. She scoffed and stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with Willow and Charles. I stared at them, my jaw clenched. Get out, I said to Charles. Now! Charles hesitated, looking at Willow for support, but she didn't say anything. He grabbed his coat and walked out without a word, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing through the house. Willow stood up, reaching for me. Jameson, I stepped back, holding up a hand. Don't. Just don't. She sank back onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I turned and walked out of the room, my chest heavy, but my resolve unshaken. Upstairs, I closed the door to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of their consequences and my freedom. The tension in the room was suffocating. I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the people who had ripped my life apart. My wife, Willow, sat hunched on the couch, her face streaked with tears. Charles stood near the doorway, his arms crossed defensively, his jaw tight, like he was waiting for this all to blow over. Lila, my daughter, sat at the edge of the armchair, her eyes wide with guilt, tears silently streaming down her face. You betrayed me, I said, my voice calm, but heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. All of you? Willow's sobs broke the silence. Jameson, I'm sorry. Please, I didn't mean. Didn't mean what? I snapped, cutting her off. Didn't mean to cheat on me with my own brother. Didn't mean to let our daughter lie to my face every single day. Didn't mean to destroy our family. I didn't. Don't lie again, Willow, I said, my voice rising. Not now. I've had enough of your lies to last a lifetime. Charles finally spoke, his tone defensive. Jameson, I know you're upset, but this isn't all on Willow. Shut your mouth, I said sharply, taking a step toward him. He stiffened but didn't move. You have the audacity to speak after what you've done? You're supposed to be my brother, my blood. And you were sneaking into my house like a thief, stealing my wife, my family, my life. What kind of man does that? Charles's face twisted, but he said nothing. I turned back to Willow. And you? You were supposed to be my partner, Willow. My wife. I gave you everything, everything. I worked late, I sacrificed. I trusted you. And this is what you do. You throw it all away for him. Willow sobbed harder, her hands clutching the sides of her face. Jameson, please. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I said coldly. And now you'll live with it. Lila, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lie to you. But Mom, don't, I said, turning to her. Don't try to pin this on your mother. You knew what was happening, Lila, and you said nothing. You helped them hide it. You betrayed me too. Lila's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't mean to. I was scared. I didn't want to lose my family. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You've lost it anyway. The room fell silent again, save for Willow's quiet sobs and Lila's sniffles. I turned back to Charles, who had been inching toward the door like a coward trying to escape. "Where do you think you're going?" I said, my voice low. Charles stopped, his hand halfway to the doorknob. "Jameson, I think it's best if I leave." "Oh, you're leaving, all right," I said, stepping closer. "But not before you hear what I have to say." Charles swallowed hard, his confident demeanor cracking. "You don't get to walk out of here and pretend this never happened," I said, my voice growing louder. "You destroyed your relationship with me, with this family. You've made your choice, Charles. And now, as far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my brother." "Jameson, no." I cut him off, my voice like steel. "I'm done with you. Don't call me. Don't come near me. Don't even think about me. You're dead to me." Charles looked at Willow, as if hoping for some kind of support, but she didn't say a word. She sat there, her face buried in her hands, too ashamed or too broken to look at him. "Get out," I said, pointing to the door. Charles hesitated for a moment, then turned and left, the sound of the front door slamming echoing through the house. I turned back to Willow, who flinched at the intensity of my gaze. "Jameson," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me. Don't leave us. Fix this," I said, laughing bitterly. "You think this can be fixed? You think I can ever trust you again? After what you've done?" "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't love me," I said, my voice cold. "You love what I gave you, security, comfort, a roof over your head. But me? No, Willow, you don't love me. If you did, you wouldn't have done this." She started to cry again, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "Not anymore. I hope it was worth it," I said, turning away from her. "Because you've lost everything now." Lila stood up, her face streaked with tears. "Dad, please don't leave. We can fix this. We can be a family again." "A family?" I said, turning to her. "This isn't a family. A family is built on trust, on love, on respect. This is a lie." Lila sobbed, but I didn't have it in me to comfort her. I walked to the stairs, pausing at the foot of them to look back at Willow and Lila. "I'll be in touch with my lawyer," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Willow, you'll get the papers soon. And Lila," I hesitated, my heart breaking all over again. "I hope one day you'll understand why I can't stay." With that, I turned and walked upstairs. I closed the door to the guest room behind me, leaning against it as the weight of everything crashed down on me. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of everything I had built, everything I thought I knew. But as I sat there in the silence, one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. Not anymore. The days that followed were quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. I had spent my first night in the guest room, unable to sleep, my mind consumed with what I needed to do next. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. They had taken my trust and torn it apart. Now it was my turn to make them understand the weight of their actions. The morning after the confrontation, Willow approached me in the kitchen. She looked like a shadow of herself, her hair unkempt, her eyes swollen from crying all night. She clutched a coffee mug in her trembling hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Jameson," she began softly, her voice barely audible. "Can we talk?" I glanced at her, but said nothing, sipping my own coffee. The silence stretched until she couldn't take it anymore. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I've ruined everything. But you've already said everything you needed to say," I interrupted, setting my mug down with a deliberate clink. "Now it's my turn." Her lips quivered, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll listen." I leaned forward, my voice steady but sharp. "You betrayed me in the worst way possible. You didn't just cheat, you did it with my brother. You brought him into my home, into our lives, and you involved Lila. Do you even realize how disgusting that is?" Tears streamed down her face. I know it was wrong. I made a horrible mistake, Jameson. I wasn't thinking, no," I snapped. "You were thinking. You knew exactly what you were doing. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences." Her face went pale. What do you mean? You'll see, I said coldly, standing up and walking away. The first step was ensuring Willow had no place to run. I called my lawyer that morning, and by the afternoon, divorce papers were being drawn up. I made it clear in the documents. I wanted full ownership of the house, no spousal support, and minimal contact with her unless it was absolutely necessary for Lila. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. When the papers arrived a few days later, Willow was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. I dropped the envelope onto the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Your future," I said flatly. She opened the envelope with shaky hands, her eyes scanning the contents. As she read, her face crumpled, and she looked up at me, horrified. "You're divorcing me? What did you expect?" I said, crossing my arms. "That we go back to how things were? That I just forgive you?" "I was hoping," she trailed off, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Jameson, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes." I laughed bitterly. "Counseling won't fix this, Willow. You made your choice. Now you'll live with it." Charles's downfall came next. He thought he could slink back into his life unscathed, but he underestimated me. I knew things about him, secrets he'd shared over beers in the past, things he never thought I'd use against him. I made a few calls to people who mattered in his world, his boss, his clients, even an old girlfriend who still had a grudge. I didn't have to lie. I just let the truth speak for itself. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Within a week, Charles was on the verge of losing his job. His colleagues stopped inviting him to lunches, his clients began requesting other representatives, and his once polished reputation was in tatters. One evening, he showed up at the house, banging on the door like a madman. I opened it just enough to see his panicked face. "What the hell are you doing, Jameson?" he shouted. "You're ruining my life." I smirked. "I'm just letting everyone see the real you, Charles." "You can't do this," he yelled, his voice cracking. "We're family." I stepped out onto the porch, towering over him. "Family? You stopped being family the moment you slept with my wife. Now get off my property before I call the police." He glared at me, his jaw clenched, but he knew he had no power here. With a frustrated growl, he turned and stormed off. Lila was the hardest to deal with. She had stayed mostly silent since that night, her guilt evident in the way she avoided me. I didn't lash out at her the way I had with Willow and Charles. I couldn't. She was still my daughter, but she needed to learn that actions had consequences. One afternoon, she came into the guest room where I was staying. She stood in the doorway, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Dad," she said quietly. I looked up from my laptop. "What is it, Lila?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I should have told you. I should have said something. But I was scared." I sighed, setting my laptop aside. "Come here." She hesitated, then crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. I could see the fear and guilt in her eyes, and it broke my heart. "Lila," I began, keeping my voice gentle. "You're my daughter, and I'll always love you. But what you did, it hurt me, more than you can imagine." She sniffled, wiping her eyes. I didn't know how to stop it. Mom told me not to say anything, and Uncle Charles said it was none of my business. I thought if I stayed quiet, everything would be okay. I reached out and took her hand. "Sometimes staying quiet makes things worse. But you're young, and I know this wasn't your fault. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," she said, her voice trembling. "Promise me that you'll never let anyone silence you again. If you see something wrong, you speak up, no matter what." She nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "I promise." As for Willow, her punishment was simple. She lost everything. She tried to fight the divorce, tried to negotiate for the house, for money, for some semblance of the life she'd grown used to. But my lawyer was ruthless, and Willow had no leverage. When the court sided with me, she was forced to pack her things and move out. The day she left was a quiet one. She stood by the door, her suitcases at her feet, her face hollow. "Jameson," she said softly, "I know you'll never forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "Goodbye, Willow." She lingered for a moment, then nodded and walked out the door. I didn't watch her leave. By the time it was all over, I felt a strange sense of peace. The people who had betrayed me were gone, their lives in ruins, while I was finally free. It wasn't a victory, it didn't feel like one, but it was justice. And that was enough. The house was too quiet after Willow and Lila moved out. The absence of their voices, footsteps, and the sounds of daily life was deafening at first. But over time, I learned to embrace the silence. It became a canvas for something new, an opportunity to rebuild, not just my home, but my sense of self. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office. It wasn't just about escaping the empty house. It was about proving to myself that I could thrive. My colleagues noticed the change. Jameson, my boss, said one afternoon, walking into my office, "I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but your focus has been incredible lately. You've been killing it." I nodded, offering a small smile. "Thanks. Just trying to keep busy." He leaned against the doorframe, studying me. "Well, keep it up. There's a big promotion coming up, and your name's at the top of the list." The words hung in the air, filling me with a sense of validation I hadn't felt in months. Outside of work, I started exploring hobbies I'd neglected during my marriage. I joined a gym, finally putting effort into my health. The physical activity was a release, each punch to the heavy bag feeling like a small step toward reclaiming control over my life. One day, while finishing a workout, I noticed a woman struggling to adjust the weight on a machine nearby. She was tall, with curly brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail. "Need a hand?" I asked, walking over. She turned and smiled. "That obvious, huh?" I chuckled. "A little. Here, let me show you." As I adjusted the weights, she introduced herself. "I'm Rachel, by the way." "Jameson," I said, shaking her hand. From that small interaction, a friendship began. Rachel was everything Willow wasn't. Down to earth, genuine, and kind. We'd meet at the gym regularly, exchanging stories and laughs. Over time, those gym sessions turned into coffee dates, then dinner. One evening, as we sat at a small Italian restaurant, Rachel looked at me curiously. "You never talk much about your past," she said, swirling her wine. "What brought you here?" I hesitated, the weight of the question settling between us. But Rachel's sincerity made it easier to open up. "I went through a rough divorce," I admitted. "Found out my wife was cheating on me with my brother." Her eyes widened. "Wow, I'm so sorry, Jameson. That's horrible." I shrugged. But in a way, it was the wake-up call I needed. I'd been stuck in a life that wasn't right for me. Losing it forced me to find myself again. Rachel reached across the table, placing her hand on mine. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're doing an amazing job at rebuilding." Her words warmed something in me I thought had gone cold forever. Meanwhile, Willow and Charles's lives continued to unravel. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Willow had been struggling. She had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, taking odd jobs to make ends meet. Charles, on the other hand, had hit rock bottom. After losing his job, he had bounced from one opportunity to another, each failure compounding his misery. He tried reaching out to me once, sending a long email apologizing for everything. I deleted it without replying. I didn't take joy in their suffering, but it gave me closure. Knowing they were dealing with the consequences of their actions allowed me to move on without bitterness. Lila's absence in my life was the hardest to bear. She had chosen to stay with Willow, and though I understood her reasons, it didn't make the silence any easier. I missed her terribly, the sound of her laughter, the way she used to confide in me about school and friends. One afternoon, months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from her. Seeing her name flash on my phone screen sent a wave of mixed emotions through me. "Lila," I said, answering. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly. "How are you?" "I'm doing well," I said cautiously. "How about you?" "I'm okay," she replied. There was a long pause before she continued. "I miss you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "I miss you too, Lila. I know I messed up," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have told you what was going on. I should have stood up to Mom and Uncle Charles. I was just scared." "Lila," I said gently, "I understand why you did what you did. But trust is something that has to be earned back. It's going to take time. I'll do whatever it takes, she said desperately. Then start by being honest with me and with yourself, I said. That's all I ask. She sniffled, and I could tell she was crying. I will, Dad. I promise. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. Rachel became a constant in my life, her presence a source of comfort and joy. One night, as we walked along the beach, she stopped and turned to me. Jameson, she said, her voice steady, I know you've been through hell, and I know you're still healing, but I need you to know that I care about you a lot, and I'm not going anywhere. I looked at her, the ocean breeze tugging at her hair. Rachel, you've been my anchor in ways you don't even realize. I'm scared to open up again, but I want to try. With you. She smiled, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. That's all I needed to hear. As I stood in my newly renovated home one evening, looking out the window at the sunset, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The betrayal, the pain, the anger, it was all behind me now. I had rebuilt my life brick by brick, rediscovered who I was, and found someone who truly valued me. Willow and Charles's suffering had been a necessary chapter in my journey, not because I reveled in their pain, but because it allowed me to close that book for good. As for Lila, our relationship was still a work in progress. But I held on to hope that we could rebuild something stronger, one day at a time. For the first time in years, I felt free from lies, free from betrayal, and free to be the man I was always meant to be.